And I'm going to go ahead and screen share. Okay. Is going to be kind of a swollen base at the stem of the axis. I'm sure we've all looked at these. I've got a couple examples, crocus and the gladiolus bulbs. Gladiolas are hardy here, as are crocus, but gladiolas will usually replicate. So if you're up from the north, you'll note that most times up there you have to dig these up. Otherwise, they're going to freeze and won't come back in the spring. But here in the south, they will live just happily in the soil and replicate for you. And you can get all sorts of beautiful flowers, cut flowers. They make great cut flowers. The thrillers, spiller, and fillers work just as well in a vase situation as they do other containers. So for cut flowers, so you can have those. But this is you can kind of see here. You've got the new corm, which is going to be that new bulblet, and then the cormal, which is on the bottom. That's the mother corm or the corm from the previous year. Those will get absorbed over time, and the little new corm that's produced, that will grow. And then over time, those will split off as they are ready. And then you'll have additional plants that will grow around there. So after a few years, you can dig those up if you wish, separate them, plant them, thin them out a little bit, give them away, whichever you want. Next is tubers. It's a modified stem structure that kind of develops on these underground stems. So you can also have the tubercles, but good examples of these are going to be caladiums and Irish potatoes. So again, as I mentioned, sweet potatoes and I just call them regular potatoes are not the same thing, but you can see that caladium there. A lot of times those will be sold. You go to Home Depot, you find those bags of roots or tubers that are have been set out, dried. Those are usually one of those that are available. They come in all sorts of different colors. They're very pretty, and they are not cold hardy. So don't plant them in the ground and expect they'll come back next year. They will rot. But they are perfectly happy. You can dig them up and set them on some newspaper and let them dry out and put them back into the ground in the spring, and they will do fine. You can buy these that are already pre-sprouted, like in this pot here, or you can just buy the tubers and then plant them every year. And then a lot of folks, of course, are growing potatoes. So we know when we put those potatoes, I think there were some Harvest Gwinnett competitions going on to see if we could have some potatoes in this fall, some short day potatoes. So interested to see how those are going. Rhizomes, these are specialized structures where the plant grows horizontally or just below the surface. Probably the most famous one that everybody thinks of is going to be your iris. You see there, I've got some examples. You've got the canna lily. Those tend to get clumped up really easily, especially in a wetter area. They grow really well there in full sunshine. You've got calla lilies. They're very pretty. Great cut flowers, and you can grow them in your own yard. And then, of course, iris. Those are very pretty. Lilies of the valley, we don't see those very much here. They're more of a temperate flower, but I have seen them successfully grown kind of around usually HVAC units outside where you've got a constant drip, where it's maybe on a shadier side of the house that's kept moist all the time. I have seen them successfully grow there. Otherwise, it's more of a northern or Midwestern temperate type of flower. The rhizomes have the same internal and external structure as these true stems. So unlike the corm that you saw, everything looks the same on here. It's just kind of an extension of the root system or the root. Okay, terminology. So fall flowering bulbs, these are going to flower in late summer or early fall. Winter flowering bulbs, these are tender bulbs that can be forced to bloom out of season. Paper white narcissus is one. A lot of times that'll flower in January, December, somewhere in there. Don't put them outside, they'll freeze. Spring flowering bulbs, These are what we kind of typically think of as Dutch bulbs, and those are planted in the fall. They bloom the following spring, and most of them are going to be hardy here. Some of them do better. Some of them will reproduce. Some of them kind of fade out, and we'll talk about those as we go through. I have a selection that we'll talk about. Summer flowering bulbs, these are hardy or some tender bulbs, and they'll typically flower in summer. And some of them will continue to flower all summer long, all the way through frost when they die back. So site selection. So let's talk about where you would want to put bulbs. So you need to kind of take into, just like any other plant, you got to take into the requirements, light requirements for them. Do they like shade? Do they like sun, full sun, part sun? You have to also think about sun intensity, spring versus full summer. These are spring bulbs, but there is a smattering of summer bulbs that have been mixed in here. So, this is kind of a generality of what you would think of when you were planting bulbs. So knowing Georgia and knowing that the sun is a little more intense here in the summertime, keep that in mind. Also keeping in mind trees. Are you dealing with deciduous trees that don't have any leaves in the winter? Are you dealing with evergreens, pines that have needles all year round? So they're not going to have a lot of extra sun to give in the wintertime. If you have some that start blooming or start coming up early, that bulb is replenishing all of its energy with the sunlight. It's a plant just like anything else. And so if you don't give it enough sunlight, it's not going to survive, and it will gradually, its persistence will lessen and lessen until it's just not there. So basically select a spot where they're going to get all of the things that they need, the light, the soil type, water needs, that kind of thing. And making sure about the light. That's, again, you want to make sure that some of these more tender plants don't get too much light, especially in like the southern part of the state. And consider where you're going to put these beds. If you're going to spend a lot of money on these bulbs, and I mean, they're not cheap. I've seen the prices go up and up and up. And I mean, I think you can buy a bag of maybe 25 daffodil bulbs now, and shoot, those things are closing on $30 or $40. And I mean, if you get some of the really interesting double blooms and different colors and all of that, they're really expensive. So you want to make sure wherever you put them that they're going to be artfully located so that you can see them, your neighbors can see them, and everybody can go, oh, look at those beautiful bulbs. So just make sure that when you're working on your landscape plan, you take that into account. Bed preparation, kind of just what it says. You want to make sure that you have a really good quality soil. So if you are dealing with hard pan clay, which is what a lot of us are dealing with, make sure you're tilling that up. Make sure that you're adding some organic matter, some compost, that kind of thing. Loosen that soil up so that those beautiful bulbs have something to actually grow into. Make sure you're fertilizing. Make sure the pH is correct. I mean, all the same things that you would do if you were investing in other plants, like perennials that you would plant in the summertime. Some things to note. So a lot of times, especially, and I'll just say Home Depot or Walmart or some of those that have those big displays where they've got all of those nets of different types of bulbs. Sometimes they're spring flowering bulbs, sometimes they're summer. Look at them. You're always going to see stuff that at the end of the season they are trying to liquidate and get rid of. There's usually a reason, folks. Those are the worst ones. They probably aren't going to survive. Sometimes you get lucky, but they are like the spring flowering bulbs that you get might be leftovers, and you want to make sure that it's not rotten. You want to make sure that the bulb is healthy, that kind of thing. Bulbs are graded and sold according to size. So if you go to the dollar store, and yes, you can get bulbs at the dollar store, those are probably going to be the cheaper bulbs that are not the same quality that you would get as a potted plant or sold in some of those Home Depot or Walmart netted bags that you can actually now pay a lot of money for. So those larger bulbs are going to produce more flowers. We've seen that with amaryllis, so that's a good one. A lot of times people are planting them now, and then around Christmas time, you'll have those forced blooms. And if you get a really big bulb, that's going to produce probably, I don't know, 2, 3 flowers for you. And the nice thing is that afterwards you can go and plant those outside. So just keep them inside until the spring. But the largest bulbs are not necessarily going to be the best for like good landscape effect. So just kind of, temper that with availability and size and budget, and, just kind of go from there. Spacing. So planting depth and spacing are really important. You need to understand that not every bulb is going to have the same depth preference. It's not going to have the same spacing preference. When you have a big amaryllis bulb, maybe as compared to, trying to think of like a gladiolus bulb, those are small and those are large. And some like to be planted deeper, some shallower. So make sure that that's what you're actually doing. So I've got here the rule of thumb, which we use that a lot, is going to be 2 or 3 times the greatest diameter of the bulb, and 3 to 4 times for smaller bulbs. So I don't, I just usually kind of look at the package, and if it says 4 inches, then I try to kind of eyeball it and put it at 4 inches. But if you're looking at, and I'm talking about the depth, or sorry, the width, always look at the depth. So like, for instance, gladiolus bulbs, those are very tall vertical flowers, and they'll lop over really easily. We'll talk about interplanting in a bit. Sometimes that's a wise choice, especially if you're dealing with some of those taller spindly bulbs. Excuse me. But you want to make sure that your depth and that your spacing apart is looks like what you see down there in that picture below. So I know sometimes the soil here is just horrible. A lot of folks, you can buy those little bulb planters that you see. They're round like this, and then you stick them in the dirt, and you're supposed to be able to twist it, pull out the soil, and then you can put the bulb in there. Sometimes that's not feasible here in the Midwest and places where you have a lot more organic matter in the soil. You can do that. Here, it's really hard. So you'll probably find yourself doing something like what you see here on the bottom, and that's digging the whole area out, laying out all of your bulbs. And you may want to draw that out on a piece of paper first. And then after you've laid everything out at the different depths that it needs to be, you just go back in and put the soil back in. I put some mulch over the top of it, water it really well, and you'll be good to go. So planting and spacing. So when you're spacing them, you need to know how much each plant needs. As I mentioned before, they're all different. So you really need to know what you're working with. Also consider the effect. You don't want, here it's mentioned, you don't want to broadcast those bulbs over the ground. I've seen that, you've seen that. I think we've all seen it in magazines. There's probably some videos out there where they said, just take a bag of bulbs and just chunk it out there, and then wherever that bulb lays is where you're going to plant it. Please don't do that. It doesn't give you a naturalistic look, and you can injure those bulbs and actually cause problems with them. Once they're in the ground and they're subjected to moisture, and if you've got any damage on those bulbs, that can rot. So you may have just, eliminated half the bulbs that you just paid a lot of money for by doing something like that. So just don't do that. Don't broadcast them across the ground. Do it with more purpose. And make sure they're planted correctly. So rhizomes and tuberous roots need to be on their sides, and bulbs upright. So you need to make sure you know top from bottom, and make sure that you water very carefully afterwards so that they have a good start. All right, so interplanting. Here's my QR code, and that actually goes to a nice little publication. It is not an extension publication, but it does have some good information about interplanting. And this is basically when you combine bulbs with other bulbs or with herbaceous perennials and low-growing shrubs. And interplanting is good for all sorts of things, not just bulbs. I mean, you can do that with edible plants. I recommend sometimes people who can't have a garden, maybe plant blueberries within their landscape plants, their foundation plantings. Sometimes you're kind of limited by what the HOA will allow, but you can sneak a few things in here and there. So you want to choose combinations that have similar growing requirements that'll bloom at about the same time if you want to create that big kind of eye-popping impact, or combine plants that have kind of an overlap. So and a lot of times with pollinating plants, we tell folks plant a wide variety so that you've got stuff growing and blooming all through the season. And that goes on here too, because there's not only spring plants, but also summer plants that are bulbs. So you can kind of really get more bang for your buck, and your house will look pretty all spring and summer. You can also stack bulbs. So as we mentioned before, different bulbs prefer different depths. You can see the visual guide below, and you can stack them. So if you only have a small planting bed where you're really limited in space, space is in this way with just plant things that are at different depths. You can get them all in there. So you can see right there, that's a lot of different plants, and they'll all come up and they'll look really pretty. It'll look similar to what you see in that top part. So, kind of be, a little inventive in what you're thinking of putting out there. So you can also look at using bulbs as a companion to flowering trees. Sometimes you can find bulbs that echo the same color that the trees flowers are going to have. So maybe you've got some cherry trees that bloom really nicely in late spring, early summer. Well, see if you can find some pink dahlias or maybe some gladiolas. It's a good way to kind of really enhance that and bring out those pretty colors. You can also, if you have some ground covers that may be kind of boring, you can get a pop of color in the middle of them by putting some bulbs in there. So some choices of evergreen ground covers, periwinkle, pachysandra, sedums. And then, of course, you can even look at creeping junipers and some of those other types. And kind of just another rule of thumb, make sure that whatever perennials that you're using, that obviously everything has to be suitable and growing together, but you may want to pick slower growing perennials so you don't have to go in there and separate them out so that you disturb those bulbs. So choose things that maybe grow a little bit slower. Care and maintenance, some mulches and ground covers. I always recommend those here in Georgia. It can get really hot and dry in the summertime. And, even dry now, our typical weather systems, once the summer thunderstorms kind of dry up, we get a little bit of this dry time between September and November, December, where unless you get a tropical storm that rolls through, you're not going to get a whole lot of weather. So that's just how it is. It's the rain, the way the rainy system kind of rolls here, and then it'll pick back up again, usually in December. They're talking about a really strong El Nino this year. So that typically means wetter than average. That'll, like I said, pick up probably in December, but right now it's very dry. So you can really see the impact if you put mulch down on your planting beds, and you can get that free. City of Lawrenceville has some of that available. You can check, they have a website, and you can make your own. You can get chipdrop.com will come and they'll dump a big load of wood chips out there from a lot of the tree companies that frequent the area. So you can get free mulch, or you can pay for it, whichever, but that's a good thing to put on there. It's also going to minimize the winter injury if you have bulbs that might be a little bit more tender, and it will be a cleaner area, keep the weeds and things out. It's going to prevent splashback for mud splattering, and pretty much anything can be a mulch. So I've got down pine straw, bark, leaves, other stuff like that. I mean, we've all seen the naturalized look where you have daffodils or jonquils popping up in the woods. Looks good, old homesteady kind of feel to it, but you can do that in your own place by interplanting underneath the trees. And also keep in mind that it can also offer a type of protection. I've got an allium there Those are really tall, so are gladiolas, and that can help support them a bit. So some more care and maintenance. Try not to cut that foliage back until it dies back naturally, until it's brown. That's why interplanting is actually a good idea, because as that foliage dies back, those summer perennials, if it's a spring bulb, those summer perennials will kind of fill in and hide that foliage so that you can allow it to do that naturally. Summer flowering bulbs are going to produce their foliage in the spring, and it'll hang around until the cold weather kills it off. So just make sure that you're going and doing your regular garden hygiene, making sure that you're cleaning things up and getting it out. If there's any disease, cut it off, get rid of it, get it out of there. If not, it can go in the compost pile. And let's see, most of the fall flowering bulbs produce foliage, when the spring flowering bulbs do. So flowering at different times, that kind of thing. Watering. So normal rainfall here can be pretty spotty. As we've all seen, we've had 3 weeks with 0 rain, which is everything around me is starting to wilt, but it's supposed to start raining tomorrow and be through this weekend. Not a lot, but it's better than nothing. So just make sure that when you're planting, just like anything else, that you're going to do some really deep soaking water for those bulbs, because they need that. And then during dry weather, just like anything else, you're going to get out there and water, which is where the interplanting comes in, because if you've got other things in there, they're going to benefit from the watering as well. And you don't feel silly when you're watering bare ground. So just kind of keep an idea, and just like that, anything else, they're going to have a higher requirement for water when they're actively growing versus dormant. And just a bit of trivia here. I know a lot of us have Bermuda or zoysia lawns. Those go dormant in the wintertime. You still have to water. If you've gone a month and you've not had any water, get out there and water. Your root system is still alive, and you can end up with winter damage. And just like any other plant, if you're not supporting that immune system in that plant by keeping it healthy, you may end up with problems, and that means fungal issues. You may end up with some fungus in your grass in the spring. So same thing here. Just make sure you're giving them good supportive therapy, watering them, fertilizing, all of that, everything they need. They still need it because they're a plant. Dividing and propagating. That's one good thing about a lot of these bulbs that are hardy here, is that you can, after a period of time, divide them up and pass them around to your friends or sell some. So they're all eventually going to become overcrowded if they like where they are. So know that you probably at some point will have to divide and pull them apart, give them away, sell them, whatever you need to do. And that's going to depend on how quickly they grow. Some are going to grow faster, some slower. So just know whatever it is that you're dealing with. Be careful about when you're digging. So I personally don't do this, although if you are a very organized person, it's a good thing to do. If you have a house and you have a bunch of planting beds, draw diagrams so you know where things are around your house. That way you don't go digging in a bed, forgetting what you have there, and cut a lot of your plants and your bulbs in half. That just, some of them might be okay, but again, we have a lot of disease here, and you may end up with bacterial growth or fungal growth, and they rot and they die because you weren't thinking about where you were digging. So for instance, bulbs and corms, when you have the replicates on there, the little bulblets, you can pull those apart when they're ready, and then you can plant them wherever. And tubers and rhizomes, you can cut those into pieces. Usually you'll see an eye, they call it an eye, so you'll see where those are, and you can just kind of cut those off. And tuberous roots can be split apart, so they'll kind of grow together, and you can after you get all the soil off of them, you can kind of wiggle them apart, and there might be a small bit that's still attached, but that's okay. You can just pull them apart and then let them dry a bit before you replant. Storing bulbs. So after you're digging them for the winter, or if you're going to divide them and then give them away. You can store them. Generally, that means knocking off as much soil as possible so that you don't have anything remaining on the rootlets that are there, letting them cure a little bit. And you want to store them in a dry place, not in full sun, that'll cook them, preferably at kind of an ambient temperature. A lot of people will store them in their garage. Just keep in mind that last cold spell we had in December and then again, I don't know, what was it, January? That if you'd been doing that in your garage, you probably would have lost your bulbs because most people's garages are not heated. And so, those would die. They would get rotten. The tissue would die. You also want to make sure that you've got good air circulation. And I've got an example of some moldy looking bulbs that are there. So if you start seeing mold developing, get rid of them, pull them away. Some types of bulbs you might, like iris, you might be able to carve off some of those. You can get sulfur and you can roll those after you cut the diseased portion off, roll it in sulfur. Sometimes that will stop the bacteria from growing and basically rotting the rest of the bulb, but not always. So just be very careful when you're storing them initially. And then, of course, remember tender bulbs need to be dug in early fall and stored in the winter before replanting the following spring. A lot of times, if you're from the Northeast or from the Midwest, that's just kind of the thing that you have to do because not many things are hardy there. Whereas here, you get a lot more things that are hardy. But if you're dealing with some stuff that might come from a more tropical area, you will have to do that. All right, let's talk about the different types. So spring flowering bulbs, and I think there's a few, I would call it more like early summer bulbs, but yeah. All right, Gloria of the Snow. So this is a good bulb for naturalizing, and it increases by bulblets. So if you remember back to, I think it was a gladiolus bulb, and it showed that little bulblet on there. So that's how they'll reproduce. And you can kind of, get a whole bunch of them actually. So you pull up that clump that you see down there, clean it off, clean off the bulbs, and then you would pull off all the little bulblets off of that. It is hardy, and you would plant it at about 2 to 3 inches apart. And then as it grows and naturalizes, it'll fill that area in so that you see a nice clump like that. So very pretty little blue flower, good woodland type flower. Crocus. Crocus are the harbinger of spring. So you don't see them as often down here as you do in the Midwest. I think a lot of people like to plant them up there because it snows. And these little guys are usually the first thing you see poking out of the snow in the spring. It's like, oh, spring is here. I see flowers. It's awesome. So I have some planted here. They lasted, the persistence of their bulbs is not quite as good. They are very pretty. You've got whites and purples and yellows, and they still bloom very early in the spring, very pretty. So I can recommend them. And, I have a few that pop back up. Make sure you put them in an area where they're going to get enough moisture. There are a lot of different species, hybrids, a lot of different colors and variations of the colors that you see there, but that's like the typical type. And you may see them pop up here in December or January. The weather here is kind of funky. A lot of times you'll see the naturalizing daffodils, and those will pop up at, they're supposed to be a spring flower, but they pop up a lot earlier than that sometimes. So will these flowers. So just make sure they've got mulch to kind of protect them. Some species will naturalize freely and they're self-seeding. So if you put them in a space where they like it and they're happy, then you may end up with more of them. And you'll want to make sure that you plant 2 inches deep at least and 3 to 4 inches apart. Snowdrops. So again, these are one of the first ones you'll see in naturalized or kind of wildflower type situations out in the woods. They are pretty little white flowers, naturalize well. A lot of times people will plant these in their woodland gardens. They look really at home there. It's hardy, and you can get some of the newer cultivars that are a little bigger and may flower later. But these guys you're going to plant about 2 inches deep and 2 inches apart, and they will fill in and naturalize very nicely. Hyacinths, we all love hyacinths. I mean, this is probably my number one flower that it smells so good. To me, this is the smell of spring. And I always get suckered into going to Publix or, you know, what else? Kroger's, where they sell the individual bulb in the little bulb jar, or you can buy the little pot that has 3 of them in there. And I think the pink ones smell the best personally. So like I said, I always get suckered. I spend $10 on a pot of bulbs that is probably only worth a fraction of that. But oh man, the smell is wonderful. I'll take them to work with me just so I can smell them. I love these flowers. So these guys, you can get some of the newer varieties, and they aren't as persistent. So I've had them last 4 or 5 years, and as you go through each successive year, the bulbs will get smaller and smaller, and the flowers don't get as noticeable. So you're going to have to come back and plant these periodically. Just know that. But you can also plant that French Roman hyacinth, the ones below. So they look like hyacinth, but they are not as impressive as the other cultivar. And, but they do tend to last a little bit longer. I've noticed that in my woodland gardens. So those guys, plant them at about 4 inches deep and about 5 inches apart for the bigger bulbs. And you can plant them a little bit narrower space for the smaller French Roman hyacinth. Iris, one of my favorites. This is probably more of an early summer, late spring, early summer type flower. And a lot of them will flower, even into the summer. There's so many different types of iris. These are just a few, but there's swamp iris and just, there's other types of iris. But anyway, rhizomatous iris, say it fast. Rhizomatous iris. So you've got bearded, Siberian, Japanese. Those are the typical ones that you're going to find in your flower gardens. But again, I mentioned there's swamp iris. I see those along ponds, and you can sometimes get them to grow in wetter areas like around a downspout or something along the lines of there. Again, blooming mid-spring to early summer. And because, as I mentioned, some like a lot of water, some not so much. Some prefer a lot more organic matter, some not so much. You get some of the old-timey varieties or the heritage varieties, and they're pretty easy keepers. You don't have to do a whole lot. They're all hardy. You don't have to dig them at the end of the season. They're fine. Plant them at about 4 inches deep. They don't need to go very deep at all. Sometimes you'll see them, the soil barely covers them, and about 2 to 3 feet apart, and they will fill in. Grape hyacinth or muscari. So these little guys are really cute, and they look really pretty in a pot. They're very vivid purpley blue, and they're called that way obviously because they look like they've got grapes on their stems. So they will, if they're happy and they get enough moisture, they will naturalize, but they also do very well in a pot situation. And they work really well if you interplant them with other spring bulbs, because you'll have this pop of blue color, where you typically have warmer colors with daffodils or maybe with tulips or something like that. So it's a really nice look. There's also a white variety that's available. So, the bulb world, the nursery world, the plant breeders out there are always looking for new colors and new varieties to throw at us. So white or blue, those are your choices. Planted at about 3 inches deep and about 3 inches apart, and they'll fill in. So narcissus or daffodils, jonquils. So there's all sorts of different flowers here, 11 divisions in the genus. And Narcissus, like it says here, is just kind of a generic name, or jonquil. Like sometimes you'll hear folks talk about that. You see them out in the pastures where they've naturalized, and there's a lot of really super expensive hybrids that you can get now, or cultivars, I should say. And those maybe aren't as suitable. I always tell people, like, if you see that it's coming from somewhere really far up north, those bulbs are probably not going to do as well as some things that you get down here. So I am a big proponent of planting naturalized bulbs, and you can get those in the market bulletin. Georgia Department of Agriculture has the market bulletin. You can usually get some of those heritage bulbs there. I'm a big fan of those. They're one of the first things to bloom, pop up and bloom in the spring. Just make sure that whatever you're planting, you know what the cultural requirements are. There's a lot of differences, so I can't really go into all of them. But again, just like reading any seed packet or anything else, all the instructions you need are on the package. They're all typically very hardy. They are toxic. So one thing you can do with interplanting, if you like tulips, tulips are just like hyacinths. They don't persist very long, but squirrels love them. So if you're thinking of planting them because you love them so much, plant narcissus over the top. So the squirrels don't eat these bulbs, and a lot of times that's enough to deter them from digging them out of your bed. You can also use chicken wire over the top of your tulips, and then put these on top just for some extra protection. Siberian squill. So this is kind of a pretty little blue flower. You'll notice it looks a little bit like that. I call it a woodland hyacinth. But these are really pretty bright blue flowers. Sometimes they can get lost in a woodland situation. So that's where you bring in some of the whites and some of the pinks, other things like that. They're very good at naturalizing. So again, if you have a woodland garden, plant them and forget them. And you can also find some white varieties. These guys are hardy, and so you put them in the fall, and they'll bloom in the spring when the weather is right. And then eventually, as your clump grows, you can go in and thin those out, move them around, that kind of thing. Tulips. A lot of people love tulips. I mean, they're beautiful. Why would you not? There are so many different species and cultivars. I mean, again, just like with the daffodils or the jonquils, I can't go into all of them. So here we have 15 divisions based on bloom and parentage. I mean, just gorgeous flowers. And there are over 4,000 different varieties. So you can find pretty much any color you want, which is rare. I mean, most plants are going to put out a variety of colors, but to get almost every color is unusual. And it is one of those harbingers of spring. So just know that if you plant it here in the South, that we don't have enough cooling hours, and we typically have viruses and other things, fungal issues that some places up north don't have because it's colder up there. So they don't last very long here. You'll have to either dig them out, put them in the fridge, or you'll have to buy new bulbs every year and plant them. Just an example of that is if you go to Atlanta Botanical Garden, they will do that. They will pull out all of the bulbs in the spring and dispose of them. If you see a lot of landscape companies that are planting them, they're literally pulling the bulbs out, throwing them away. So if you want some free bulbs, you can reach out to some landscape companies and go, hey, can you save the tulips for me? Let them kind of dry up naturally and store them, and then you can plant them again in the fall for flowers in the spring. So it can be hardy in certain situations. Like I said, you have to be a little bit more up north for that. But you would plant it in the fall, and 4 to 6 inches and 4 to 6 inches apart. Spring starflower. These guys are going to be in white and purplish kind of shades. They're great for naturalizing. They multiply very quickly if they like where they are. Sometimes people get a little inventive and they'll put them in their lawns, but again, that can be a problem because you have to cut your grass. And the whole point of having them is because they flower and they look really pretty. So maybe in an area where you might have, monkey grass or something like that, that you're not going to cut. That way you can get the pretty flowers and you don't have to worry about cutting it. It's hardy, so you're going to plant it in the fall at about 3 to 6 inches, 3 inches deep and about 6 inches apart. The rain lily. So this is kind of a heritage lily. Oh, look, my artwork, my pink flower jumped in the back. It was supposed to hide some of the greenery that's poking there. Goes by many different names. The Zephyranthus lily, or the Adamasco lily, rain lily, fairy lily. And you can see these in roadside drainage ditches and wet meadows. It's kind of low growing, so you might have to look. But if you have a really wet period of time, you might see these after a soaking rain or after we've had a series of soaking rains. There are hybridized versions available, pretty ones. I didn't see anything other really than these pinks, yellows, and whites, very similar to what you would see with a crocus. But they're going to be planted in the fall about 2 inches deep and 3 to 6 inches apart. And so that's pretty much it. So we just have some eye candy to look at. These are some really pretty pictures that I found of interplanting. So the one on the left, you have some muscari, and you've got some tulips, different colors of tulips that are there, along with some perennials, and in a probably medium to later spring outlook. Looks like you've got a cherry in there. And then over on the right, you've got some more different types of tulips, the frilly ones, all different colors. So pretty. I love tulips. I wish they survived longer here. This is Atlanta Botanical Garden. So you see there's a bunch of tulips there. So like I said, they're going to rip all of those out. They just get rid of them. I'm not really sure what they do with them, but they take their big bins out and they throw them all in there and then wheel them off, and I guess they compost them. But anyway, very, very pretty. I love, 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 love tulips. And they make great cut flowers too. So you can, cut them and bring them in the house and enjoy them. Here's a few more. So the top left is where you see the naturalized jonquils or daffodils, and what most people are going to think of when you think of naturalizing. And, kind of plant it and forget it type situations where you get the old homesteads. And then tulips below, that some of the drifts of different colors. And then to the right, you've got the hyacinths along with some more jonquils. And so that's basically it. And this is my information. And I'm going to I'll hit a couple questions here. If anybody has questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. If you want to see this recording, you can go to Metro Master Gardener YouTube. All right. So Susie asked, do you know where to get the species of tulips that we can grow as perennials? I am not aware of any one particular species that is 100% naturalizing here in Georgia. Most of them are not very persistent, as I mentioned. They will last 2, 3, maybe 4 years. You'll probably get blooms for the first couple years. And then the blooms will get smaller and smaller, and then you just get the vegetation, and then eventually they just kind of give up. So I am not aware. There are, obviously in the South, you get different types of plants that do better here than they do up in the Midwest. But I personally that's not saying I know everything. I do not know everything. I am not a tulip connoisseur, because I've had to give it up because it's sad because they don't really grow here. But there may be some out there. I mean, we have trying to think of some Midwestern plants that don't do well here that do well up there. Lilacs are one. There are some southern lilacs. They do not smell the same. They look similar, I actually have a Midwestern lilac that I was curious to see if I could get it to survive. So I bought one off of one of those seed catalogs, and it's never flowered, sad as it is. It's like 25 years old, but it has survived, and it's, it continues to grow there, and it is a legitimate lilac, but it's just kind of hanging on. I'll have to look into it. I'm not aware of any though that are, the holy grail, that are going to stay in the soil and not have to be pulled out every year. So sorry about that. Would you speak a little about forcing amaryllis? Sure. So most people are going to get a little pot if you get it as a gift. A lot of people will get it as a gift. And, the bulb will be separate from the pot. You'll get a little bag of soil, and you put it in there and you water it. And the warmth of the house essentially is what's going to cause that bulb to wake up. That's a spring flowering, summer flowering bulb. So like late spring, early summer. And you can plant it here. So here, because it's considered a Christmas flower, and you can get them in all sorts of colors, reds and pinks and whites and stripes and all of that. You're going to buy it like that or get it as a gift, and it's going to bloom around, Christmas time into January. If the bigger the bulb is, the more flowers you will get out of it. You might get 2, you might get 4 flowers. And as the flowers kind of die back, just like any other bulb, you need to let it go, because that vegetation is what is putting the nutrients back in that bulb. So once it gets warm enough and you have the danger of frost is gone, go ahead and plant it outside. I've had several of them that I've planted, and they'd come back year after year. Now I've had some instances where, it's gotten too cold and they've gotten mush in the ground because they weren't planted deep enough, or I didn't put enough mulch on them. But generally speaking, yeah, you're right. They'll do well for quite a while. So you can plant them outside year round. No, like I said, if you're going to force them in the house, keep them in the house until the danger of frost is past, and then they can go out there and you can put them in the ground. Do you need to dig them up and bring them in the fall? No, I mean, if you want to force them so that they bloom around Christmas or in the middle of winter, sure, you can do that. And like I said, a lot of times people just put them in a tiny little pot, and the roots are the only thing in the soil. But the warmth from being inside, where the ambient temperature is 70 degrees, high 60s, 70 degrees, that's going to cause them to wake up and bloom in the light that they're going to get from the house. That's going to cause them to wake up. But no, after they do that, you don't want to put them back outside, because if you do that and you just set it out on the deck after it's done blooming in, say, late January or February, that's when we get the coldest weather here. So likely it's going to, get below zero, get some killing frost. It's going to kill your bulb too. So if you don't want it in the house anymore and it's done blooming and the vegetation's died back, just stick it out in your garage and, above on a shelf or something like that. Take it out of the soil, set it off to the side, and then you can put it in the ground outside in the spring. Does anybody have any other questions? Let's see. I have tulips planted after buying in a store. They return every year, at least 7 years, but leaves only. Yep. Typical. No flowers, since in shade, foliage disappeared now. If I dig them up right after they sprout in the spring and replant in sun, would they bloom? Probably not at this point, because they have depleted their stores. So what you do here, if you want to, if you have a really pretty bulb that gives you just a beautiful orange and red flower, and you love it, and you save that, after the foliage dies back, go in there and dig them up we're getting close to when it's cold, dig them up, stick them in your fridge, set them out for a bit to kind of cure some and toughen up around the outer the outer layers, and then stick them in the fridge and put them there over the winter time. And then in the spring in the fall, you can put them back in there. Put them back in the soil so they'll come up in the spring. Here, their vegetation will die back early summer-ish, June-ish, something like that. But they just don't do well here. So you can try to resurrect them. You can try giving them fertilizer. Sometimes you can boost them with fertilizer, bulb fertilizer, and you can get some blooms out of them. I've been successful with that, but they're probably small enough now. They're not the same size they were when you planted them, that they're not going to, if you're not seeing any vegetation, that's a bad sign. I'll just say that. All right, any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, thank you all for stopping by and asking a few good questions, and hopefully you learned a few things about bulbs. And you can always, I sent you all emails, so you had the link. So if you have any other questions that pop into your mind, feel free to email me and ask me. But otherwise, I guess we will see you all at the next one. Have a good evening, everybody. Bye.